Cyrus Miller Gatton, born in 1863, died in 1937. Better known in north central Ohio's lush Clear Fork Valley as simply CY GATTON. He's been gone now for well over 50 years, and yet the memory of him remains vivid, and his claim on the affections of the people of this area in and around the little Ohio villages of Belleville and Butler seems, if anything, to have strengthened with the passing of time. Why? Because he was a storyteller, and particularly because he was a master of the tall tale. The great-grandson of Isaac Gatton, one of the earliest settlers of Richland County, Ohio, CY grew up during the prosperous decades after the American Civil War, a time when the richest man around was still most generally the farmer, and storytelling was the dominant form of rural entertainment. As a boy, he must have felt the frost on his spine when he heard his Aunt Rachel recount how, riding her pony through the dusk, making the 12-mile trip back home from Mansfield, she'd heard a strange, rapid shuffling noise behind her and turned to find a pack of wolves plunging toward her. The pony took off, and she kicked its sides with her bare heels, racing with death. The wolves overtook her just as she reached the Gatton home, and her screams brought the menfolk running out of the house with rifles, firing shots into the air and scaring the wolves away in the nick of time. By CY Gatton's day, a full generation had passed since the last wolf had been seen in Richland County. But when the wild and woolly can no longer be witnessed, it can still be imagined and evoked, and CY possessed a remarkable gift for thinking up and spinning out his own adventures. A versatile all-round outdoorsman and amateur naturalist, CY inherited the family farm and set about developing orchards and a nursery. He proved to be an enterprising businessman, becoming the first Ohio nurseryman to make pine trees commercially available. His nursery, today the Wade and Gatton Nursery, is still going strong, and it's still in the family. The owner and proprietor is CY's great-grandson, Van Wade. Initially, the audiences for CY's stories were his family, friends, neighbors, customers, and visitors to the Gatton home. Then, in the 1890s, he developed Gatton Rocks, a resort area right on his farm, with cottages for rent, swimming in the Clear Fork River, and even a tennis court, if you can believe it. The Clear Fork Valley had seen nothing like it. Gatton Rocks had always been a popular local picnic spot, but now people began to come down from Mansfield and Cleveland, and up from Newark and Columbus. The railroad even made a whistle stop there at Gatton Rocks. The vacationers came for the ageless pleasures of summer, swimming and scenery, but mostly they came because of CY Gatton himself. He was such a character, a perpetrator of pranks and practical jokes. He was full of fun, bursting with stories about all the amazing things that happened on that remarkable farm of his, placing a particular emphasis on the preposterous goings-on back in the woods up behind his big house at a place known as Wildcat Hollow, where the soil was so fertile that he was afraid to plant anything out there. Until one day, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. CY's reputation as a storyteller began to spread, and as he reached his 50s, he found himself in regular demand as a professional humorist, telling his stories at banquets and picnics throughout the Buckeye State. He was especially popular with youth organizations, and there are living yet today many hundreds of older Ohioans who recall with delight the terror they felt when CY would hold forth at a Boy Scout or 4-H campfire, ruthlessly spinning out his gruesome tale of Sour Kate, who, it seems, was split right down the middle, accidentally, by an axe wielded by a jealous suitor. Her ghost, as CY told it, still treads Wildcat Hollow, and as she paces in the moonlight, you know it's her by the sound the two halves of her head make as they lightly smack together. But it was CY's mastery of the tall tale, not the ghost story, that brought him briefly to national attention in the mid-1930s, near the very end of his life. In a banquet audience, Lowell Thomas, a fellow Ohioan and the best-known news commentator of his day, found himself completely captivated by CY Gatton's stories. And later, in a nationally heard radio broadcast, he presented Cy with a certificate of membership in the Tall Story Club of New York. A few days later, Cy's certificate arrived at Gatton Rocks, bearing these words: "Know all men by these presents that it is my tall privilege to give high testimony that Cy Gatton, who tells them tall, with a lofty sacrifice of veracity, has proven his altitudinous devotion to the great American Whopper, and is hereby elevated to the rank of exalted Ananias of the Tall Story Club. Signed, Lowell Thomas, Grand Giraffe of the Tall Story Club." It was the crowning moment of Cy's career, and if he had lived another 10 years, Ohio might have had a nationally celebrated folk hero all its own, a kind of Mark Twain, Will Rogers, and Garrison Keillor rolled into one uniquely Buckeye character. So what are these stories? What are they about? What are they like? Well, you can't read them. Cy never wrote them down, and even if he had, on paper they'd be as dead as Julius Caesar. They're stories, and they've got to be told.
10,000 years ago, the glaciers come down from the north. A great wall of ice, 5,000 feet thick. Do you know the glaciers were 5,000 feet thick? Scooping out Lake Erie like a giant steam shovel and pushing all that dirt south. And as they were pushing it south, they were churning it around and sorting it and sifting it every which way. And they're saying to themselves, now look at this dirt here. Now look at this now. Dirt, soil, earth such as we have never seen. The cream of the crop. We're going to take that dirt and we're going to put it down to southern end of Richland County. That's right. Put the most fertile dirt in the county with the name Richland. Now that only makes sense. Richland County, which was quickly realized by the pioneers to be the richest county in the whole state of Ohio. But there was one spot way down there at the end, a 700-acre plot of land, which was by far the richest acreage in already what was the richest county in the whole state of Ohio. And of all those fertile acres down there, the first pioneer that carved them out of the wilderness, Isaac Gatton, he quickly saw that there was one, away back in the woods, one particular spot, a place that came to be known as Wildcat Hollow, where the soil was of such a prodigious and incredible fertility. So lush and loamy it was that Isaac was afraid to plant anything out there. That's right. He would not plant anything out to that one spot. Wildcat Hollow, no, that was hands off. Oh, he'd plant corn 50 yards back from Wildcat Hollow. And the corn stalks would come up as high as a flagpole. The ears of corn would be the size of flour barrels, and the silks would be as thick as ropes. He had to send his grandson to shinny up those corn stalks, get the ears of corn down. It's the only way they could harvest them, being up that high. But this was not even at Wildcat Hollow. This is 50 yards back. He would never plant anything out to Wildcat Hollow on account of he was afraid to. And him, known for his strength. They say he could take a horseshoe in his bare hands, and just with the sheer strength of his arms, he could take that horseshoe and tie it into a knot while it was still on the horse. He was so strong, they say he could grab himself by the collar. And just with the sheer strength of his arms, Isaac could grab himself by the collar and lift himself up 3 feet off the ground and set himself back down again. That's how strong he was. But as strong as he was, he would not plant anything out to Wildcat Hollow, and so they never did. And the years went by, and that ground was never touched. They never planted anything, never even attempted, never even thought about planting anything until one historic day. The day I want to tell you about, when that little boy that used to shinny up those corn stalks grew it up to be about 17, 18 years old, Cy Gatton, young Cy. He took up a dare from his 2 younger brothers to go out and plant something out there out to Wildcat Hollow. Now they said to him, now you think you're so big and strong and smart and tough, how about if you go out and plant something out there out to Wildcat Hollow? And he thought, well, now how hard can it be? What's there to it? You take a seed, you put it in the ground, there's nothing to that. He went out to the barn, he rummaged around, the first thing he happened to find were some cucumber seeds. He grabbed a handful of cucumber seeds and he stuffed them in his pocket, and he set off walking out to Wildcat Hollow. It was a beautiful June day. The sky was washed blue. The birds were singing in the trees, and the wind was gently blowing. And here he was, a young fool, walking along with a pocket full of cucumber seeds and an appointment with destiny. Well, he got out there to that spot, out there to Wildcat Hollow. He reached in his pocket, took out some of those seeds. He's getting ready to plant them. Hadn't thought much about it, getting ready to plant some of those seeds, when all of a sudden he noticed that something was wrong. Well, what was it? He looked around, everything looked all right. And then it come over him what it was. It was the silence. An unnatural hush had settled over the whole forest the moment those seeds had come out of his pocket. Mother Nature had put 10,000 years in the making of this moment, and now it had come. The planting, who knows, maybe the planting of the most fertile spot anywhere to be found on God's green earth. And here he was, the man of the moment, standing there with a handful of cucumber seeds. He looked around every little hole in the ground, every little hole in the trees had a pair of eyes peeking out of it. Little raccoons and squirrels looking to see what was going to happen. He was frightened. He would not mind me telling you that he was frightened. He put those seeds back in his pocket, just figured he'd call the whole thing off. He started heading back when he remembered his two younger brothers. Now, they had dared him to go out and plant something out there, and he had said there'd be nothing to it. And so, well, he realized he had to see it through. Swallowing hard to keep his courage up, he went back over there, and with a trembling hand, he reached his hand in his pocket and took out not the whole handful. He wasn't such a fool as that. He took out just one cucumber seed. And then the moment had come. He knelt down there on that spot. He quit part of that soil about 2 inches deep. He took that one seed and he put it down in there quick. And then he patted the dirt over top of it. He stood up. He thought he'd better be getting back to the barn. He started walking back to the barn. He had not gotten more than about 5 steps when he heard an explosion behind him. He looked around, and here, shooting up out of the ground, were cucumber vines wrapping around the trees and rushing off in the woods every which direction, and he was frightened. He took off running as fast as he could go. He was running through the forest as fast as he could go, but he was not fast enough. As fast as he was in those days, he was not fast enough. As fast as he was running through that forest, why, one of those cucumber vines come a snake along the ground after him, chasing him like this here right on through the forest. It wrapped around his ankle. It tripped him. Down he went before he even got up on his elbows. Why, cucumber vines were wrapping all around him, getting into his ears and down into his socks and every which way. And one of them, a green cucumber vine, started growing up around his neck, choking him. You see, don't you know, he couldn't get his breath. Tighter and tighter it got, growing fast as fast can be. He thought if he could just get his hand in his pocket, if he could get to his pocket knife, he could cut himself loose. He was trying to get his hand in his pocket to get his pocket knife out to cut himself loose, but he could not get his hand in his pocket. No, he could not even get his hand in his pocket on account there was already a full-grown cucumber in his pocket. Well, you laugh, but I want to tell you, it would have been the end of him right there. And there wouldn't have been any more CY GATTON stories. And this would have been a mighty short program. Except for one of them freakish June frosts. That's right. I know it doesn't happen very often. June frosts come along. Little ice crystals start dropping out of the sky, you see, and hit that cucumber vine. Just hit it. Hit it right between the nose, and why, sure, it withered it away and saved his life. Well, it took him a whole year to work up his courage again to where he'd go out and plant something out there out to Wildcat Hollow. But you know how it is. You get a year older, you get a year wiser. Now, am I telling the truth? That's right. Everybody knows that. And a year later, he was not such a fool as to take anything that grows quite so fast as a cucumber seed. This time he brought along a pumpkin seed. But this time he knew what was coming. He got out there this time, you see. He parted the soil with his heel like this here, you see, like here. And then he aimed that seed careful like right over that hole. And then he dropped it. He took off running and he got out of the way in time. He came back the next day with his two brothers. They brought along their wheelbarrows and saws and shovels and axes. And they cut a hole on one side of that pumpkin that had grown there overnight. And they went around, cut a hole on the other side of it. And they cleared out all the pumpkin seeds that were inside. And do you know, that whole summer long, they were able to use that pumpkin shell for a barn. Well, those are some of the plants that grew out to Wildcat Hollow. But I want to tell you now, Wildcat Hollow wasn't only famous for plants. It was also famous for animals, most notably the wildcat itself. People used to ask Mr. Gatton, they'd come to his resort in the summertime, come down from Cleveland, up from Columbus, and they'd say to him, now, Mr. Gatton, now you talk about this Wildcat Hollow out here. Now tell us straight. Are there really wildcats out to Wildcat Hollow? And he would look back at them. You can't get a straight answer out of a guy like that. He'd look back at them. Are there really wildcats out to Wildcat Hollow? He'd look back at them. He'd say, does a one-legged duck swim in circles? Of course there's wildcats out there. Why do you think we call it wild? He'd tell them how he'd been out there. And he had found a kitten of a wildcat. Now, she was an ordinary little kitten. She was a wildcat, yes, but she was an ordinary little kitten. Brought her home and kept her for a pet. Now, she was an ordinary little kitten. You give her a bowl of milk, she'd lap it up like a kitten will do. Give her a ball of yarn, she'd play with it, bat it around, chase it, jump on it. You know how a kitten will do. But they noticed they give her that ball of yarn. After about a week or so, it was all kind of worn down. There wasn't hardly anything of it left. Well, what was she doing with that ball of yarn? Well, they couldn't figure it out. They peeked around corners when she didn't know they were looking, and here they come to find that that kitten was eating that yarn down. That's right. She was nibbling it right on down, sucking it down like spaghetti, just like that, 40, 50, 60 yards. They couldn't believe it. Now, they knew it couldn't be good for her, a kitten eating yarn like that. They tried to tell her not to do it, but you can't reason with a wildcat. Oh, they're not going to listen to you. She ate that one down. Well, they give her another one. She started right in on it. Just got to be the thing, you know. She'd eat this yarn down. After a while, they didn't think anything about it. They'd go in Belleville Saturday morning, stop, get the grocery things, get a ball of yarn for the cat, give it to her, you know. They took it for granted. They paid it no mind. They gave it no thought, paid no attention to it. Until 2 years later, when that kitten come to have her first litter. And do you know that every one of them little kittens that she had was born with sweaters on? Now, Cy was full of advice and full of wisdom. He was a man famous for his appearance as well as for his stories and the depth of his character. His head was as bald as a billiard ball. He said he was bald for the same reason that you can't grow grass on a busy street. All those thoughts moving around in his head all the time, you know. Now his wife, Etta Pearl, she'd sometimes point out you also can't grow grass out of concrete. He was a man who would give advice. And when he spoke to young people, when he spoke to the scouts and in the 4-H and such groups as would come out to his farm, and they did, around the campfire, he'd tell them there's his tall tales. But he'd give them some thoughts to live by as well. And he used to tell them, when you go out walking, it's a simple thing, but when you go out walking, look up. Get in the habit of looking up. Now, you go out walking through your life, you're gonna look down all the time while you're gonna find pennies. It's true, you will find a penny once in a while, looking down all the time, but if you get in the habit of looking up when you go out walking, you see you'll harvest a far richer treasure. You'll harvest a far richer treasure than any amount of pennies you might find by looking down. And he'd tell them about what those treasures are going to be. Glorious things. You see sunsets and the glories of Mother Nature. And the seasons shifting the way they do. The flocks of geese flying overhead. The things you notice when you look up. Well, he was out one day walking along out to Wildcat Hollow with his walking stick. Now, it was not this one, but it was one like it. He was out walking out by Wildcat Hollow. And he was looking up the way he was accustomed to do, you see. Looking up when all of a sudden he heard a rattle in the grass. And this is a sound which, even if you've never heard it before, you hear it once, you know right away what it is. And he knew what it was too. He looked down, and here, I hate to tell you, I hope there's nobody here that's squeamish. He looked down here, coiled up at his feet, was one of these king-size Wildcat Hollow rattlesnakes. And before he could even step out of the way, before he could even take a step backwards, that snake made a lunge at him and sunk its poisonous, venomous fangs 2 inches deep, into his walking stick. Now, any doctor could tell you what was going to happen. And then he knew what was going to happen. He shook that snake off of there as fast as he could. He took off and running back to the barn. He did not even get halfway back to the barn before that stick had begun to swell. It swelled and it swelled. It got bigger and bigger till finally he couldn't carry it anymore. He had to leave it out there in the field, still swell. And he went out to the barn, he got some chain, got the horses, and he hitched up that walking stick and he drug it down to Butler, Ohio, 6 miles away where they had Reeder's sawmill. And he had old man Reeder saw that walking stick up into 2x4s and joists and beams and ridge poles, siding, shingles, little fancy louver doors. And they built a whole barn out of that one walking stick, a whole great barn. But it was not a successful experiment, because no sooner did they finish that great barn when up here comes a blowing up out of the west one of these terrible Richland County thunderstorms. First thing you know, the wind kicked up. Give me some wind here. Oh, yes, the wind kicked up. It was terrible, the wind. He looked up in the sky. He saw a flock of ducks flying backwards. That's right. That's your first sign, you see. That's how you know they're flying backwards to keep them getting sand in their eyes, you see. And then the wind come along. It sucked a well 60 feet deep, sucked it right up out of the ground, just like a straw out of a milkshake, just like that, a well 60 feet deep. Now, what are you going to do with a well 60 feet deep that's been sucked up out of the ground? Well, you turn it upside down and use it for a silo. And then the rain come in. That's right, the rain. Oh, rain come down hard, yeah, pouring down hard. Pitchforks and hammer handles, the rain was falling so thick people were jumping in the river to keep from drowning. That's how hard the rain came. The rain hit that barn. And as the rain hit those boards, why, it washed all the snake poison out of them. They all begun to shrink back down, you see, back down to their original size, so that when that great storm had passed, there was nothing left where that barn had been but a pile of toothpicks and tongue depressors. Now, just in case there's any skeptics in this audience that don't believe that story is true, I can prove it. Because I have along with me some of the actual toothpicks and tongue depressants which were gathered there that day. And we will be selling these for $5 a piece out in the lobby as soon as we're done here tonight. That's right. Well, Cy that spring and many other springs went out hunting. Now, Cy was a hunter and a fisherman. Oh, yes. He loved to hunt and fish. And he was out walking one day out, and he had his gun along with him. And he'd been doing some shooting that day, but he hadn't considered it a very good day. Oh, a couple dozen rabbits, 40, 50 squirrels, but not really a very good day. Now, he was walking along in a melancholy mood. He'd never had a single really good shot the whole day, sucking on a peach. You see, they brought along a peach with him, and he was chewing on it, and he was working his way down to the pit, standing there ruminating on his bad luck, when all of a sudden he saw a magnificent buck deer walk right into a clearing just about 50 yards in front of him. Well, say, Cy put that peach away pretty fast, and he raised his gun up to take a careful aim. And then he realized that he didn't have any bullets. He'd used up all of his bullets shooting squirrels and rabbits, and here was the shot of the day, and here he was without any bullets, and he was trying to think what to do, when, of course, he happened to think of that peach pit. Why, sure, got that peach out quick. Why not? Worth a try. Took the peach pit out, and he loaded it right into the gun, put a double charge of powder right in behind it, and he took a careful aim at that deer. Careful aim. He aimed right at its head, right at its forehead, aiming mighty careful. And then he pulled the trigger. But it didn't even seem to hit him. Must have missed him. The deer shrugged its shoulders and just proudly walked off into the forest. And Cy wrote it off as a bad day. That is, he wrote it off as a bad day until 1 year later, when he was out walking at that same spot. He looked up into that same clearing, and just as he looked, the same self-same deer came striding out into the clearing. And he knew it was the same deer. Why, sure, he knew it was, on account of it had a fine young peach tree growing right out of his head. Cy was out walking along in his woods, about that same part of the woods, I suppose. Walking there a few years later, out in the woods, when he heard a sound he never heard before. A kind of a funny, high-pitched, squealy sort of a sound. A kind of a high, and would the children in the audience give me a funny, high-pitched, squealy sound, please? Yeah, just about like that, that's right. And he thought, where is that sound coming from? He listened around through the forest, and he saw that it was coming from a great big old hollow tree. A hollow tree with a hole in it about this high, you see, and he put his hands up over that hole, over the bottom of that hole. He pulled himself up, and he looked down inside, and here they were. Here he saw what was making that squealy sound. Why, it was 3 little baby bear cubs. That's right. He crawled down in there with them. Oh, he'd never known there were bears in this part of the country. Here they were, 3 little bear cubs. They were like 3 little furry bowling balls, and they're rolling around and bouncing against each other. He's tickling them underneath the chin and spinning them, you know, and having a big time. They're laughing and squealing. When all of a sudden, all of a sudden, he noticed that just like that, the lights went out, and it was suddenly pitch black inside there. Why, it was as black as Egypt. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Why, what had happened? He couldn't figure. And then he looked up, and with what little light there was, he saw, yes, he saw what it was. It was the mother bear coming home. lowering herself down, you see, hind end first, coming in here on him. Now, he knew that he would not be welcome company in this presence, but there was no other way out. You see, there was no side door. And what was he going to do? Well, he couldn't think what to do, but he knew he had to think whatever it was, he had to think of it quick. Well, he happened to think of his pocket knife. Yes, he put his hand in his pocket quick. There being no cucumber this time to hinder him, he got out that pocket knife, and he took out the quickest, littlest, tiniest blade he had on that pocket knife. And then when the mother bear came down right on top of him almost, why, he grabbed a hold of her tail with his left hand. And then he gave her with that pocket knife, he gave her a and whoop, she went whoa like this, and out she went into the forest, rushing along, roaring as she went, and he was hanging on for dear life, you see, as she was running through the forest. And then, why, all of a sudden she looked back behind her, and she saw there wasn't nothing but a little man back there holding on to her tail. And so then she turned around and took off running after him, chasing him, you see, through the forest. He was running as fast as he could run. He was running fast as he could run, uphill, downhill, dodging the rocks, the trees, the valleys, and the bear was catching up with him. He could feel her hot breath on his neck, barreling down, you see. Now he thought to himself, he's even bigger trouble now than he was before. Now he thought, what you going to do, Si? You better be thinking fast. Well, the only thing he could think to do, it was crazy, but it might just work. He stopped like this. He planted his feet firm. She not expecting anything like this. He stuck his fist out, and that bear coming on in full speed like that, you see, with her mouth wide open, not looking for nothing like this, he stuck his fist right on down past that pink, slimy tongue, reaching right on down in through, deep through her throat, all the way as far as he could stretch till he grabbed hold of her tail on the inside. And then he gave a mighty yank, and he pulled that bear inside out. But it wasn't being pulled inside out that killed that bear. No, you see, what happened was when that happened, all of her fur passed through herself, and she ended up tickling herself to death. Well, that was enough of a close call for Si. He decided to slow down, take life easy after that. He thought maybe he'd just stay with farm chores there for a while, and so he devoted himself to pastoral concerns, bucolic things like mowing with a mowing scythe. Out in his field, mowing with a mowing scythe, a long-handled farm tool with a razor-sharp blade, 3 feet long, you see. He'd be out there mowing and mowing. And everything went fine and peaceful, except for the snakes. That was the only trouble, was once again the snakes were troublesome. He'd be out there, he'd be mowing, you know, everything would be fine mowing, but the snakes, he had to watch fine. And he finally just about had enough of it. I mean, snakes, there's a limit of what you can take. And he's trying to think, what do you do about this? What does a fellow do out trying to mow his field and the snakes are... And then he happened to think about his grandpa Isaac. Isaac, the first pioneer into those parts, Isaac Gatton. He had a pair of double-layer bull's hide hip boots made for himself. Isaac had. Big double-layer bull's hide hip boots. And Si thought, this is just what I need. Si went back up into the barn, up into the top of the barn, and rummaged around in some old trunks they had up there, and sure enough, he found them. There they were, in good as shape as ever. A pair of double-layer bull's hide hip boots. He pulled those hip boots on, and he went back out to the field. And then he started mowing. And he'd mow now. Oh, it was no trouble now. He'd mow. Yeah. Snakes would come up. Oh, sure, they'd come up. They'd sink their fangs right into those boots. They'd never get anywhere near him. They'd get the fangs stuck in the boots, in fact. You see, they couldn't get them back out. So that their tails would be wiggling and waggling all along. And after about a half an hour or so, he'd have 40, 50 snakes, all of them with their fangs and all waggling their tails. It didn't bother him, but it was cumbersome, you know, trying to mow with all the... And so, well, what do you think? Why, he had a sharp blade with him. He just shaved his legs, you might say. He just shaved those snakes right off of the neck. Just like that, up and down. And then that evening, imagine his satisfaction. Sitting by the fire, thinking back on a hard day's work, a well-deserved and hard-earned rest. They were sitting by the fire, plucking out those snake heads one at a time, and throw them into the flames and listen to them sizzle. But it wasn't long after that he became filled with a yearning to see the wide world, a yearning to see far off and remote and exotic places. He grew tired of living in Richland County, Ohio. He wanted to see far off, remote, and distant lands, strange ports of call where the people dress funny and don't even appear to speak English, you know, distant places. So now how is a farmer going to see the wide world? Well, he checked into the Merchant Marine, and it turned out he wasn't too old, but that they would take him. And they signed him up. They signed him up into the Merchant Marine, and he was setting off to see the wide world, saying goodbye to his mother. And his mother said to him, now, you know, Cyrus, she said, you know, you ought to take along those double-layer bull's hide hip boots of your grandpa's. Now, you never know how they might come in handy. Well, he didn't see how they could come in handy, but he wanted to humor his old mother. And so he took them along. He stuffed them in the bottom of his duffel bag, and he accepted her blessing and set off to see the wide world. 2 months later, here he was on his ship, hung up on a sandbar off the coast of Africa. They couldn't go forward, they couldn't go backward. They were stuck in place there. The ship was hung up. It's a place you could look up on the map, a place called Port Blanco, where the great Sahara Desert comes right down to meet the ocean, you see, and nothing around for miles. They looked out onto the shore. They were surprised to see, the day after they'd been there, a gang of Arabs. That's right, standing over there on the shore, waving their scarves, yelling out their strange Arab gibberish. He couldn't make any sense of it, but all the men on the ship came to him and they said, now, Si, we all know you're the bravest man on board this ship. How about if you wade ashore and see what's troubling them Arabs? So, well, he said he might as well do it. He went over to the edge of the boat. He's getting ready to hop over when he happened to think, why should he get his shoes and socks wet? I mean, after all, he's got these double-layer bull's hide hip boots along. So he went out and got his duffel bag out, and he dug out those hip boots, and he pulled them on. You see, he pulled them on, fastened them on good, and then he got into the water, and he waded right up to those Arabs. He's going to ask them what the trouble was when they jumped him. That's right. They jumped him. They tied him up. They flung him over halfway upside down over the top of a camel, and off they went into the desert, 20, 30 miles, till they came to an oasis. Out there in the middle of the desert, they set him down over here, and then they made a big fire out of some driftwood that they brought back from the beach, and they got a big iron kettle, and they filled it up with water, you see, and they're all waiting for the water to come to a boil. Now, as the water was starting to simmer, he noticed the Arabs looking at him every once in a while in a kind of a strange way, licking their lips, you see, and rolling their eyes and rubbing their lean bellies. And the more he looked at them, he realized just how scrawny looking they were. They were the skinniest bunch of Arabs any man ever see, you know. And here they were. Well, now when the water came to a rolling boil, they all turned looking at him with a strange look, and they all began to smile with their pointy Arab teeth, and they put out their long, pointy Arab fingernails, and they're all walking toward him like this. And when they got up to him, why, he got the surprise of his life. Because it turned out, why, it wasn't him they were after at all. No, it was those double-layer bull's hide hip boots, you see. Why, they yanked him off of his feet, and they flung him into that big pot, and they stirred him around in there. They stirred him around for the better part of a half an hour or so until those boots, well, they began to break down into a gelatinous mass, and then into an even brown, smooth, and aromatic beef consomme. Little golden bubbles floating around on top of it. Oh, smells mighty good. They ladled it out into a bowl, kind of a funny Arab bowl, which they offered to him, which he thought was Christian for a bunch of Arabs, but he turned them down, you know. He turned them down. He declined the opportunity. And it was a good thing he did, too. Because do you know that 10 minutes later, every one of them Arabs was as dead as Julius Caesar? Well, why, there was enough snake poison in them boots to wipe out the entire Arab nation. He brought that iron pot back with him. And for many years, you could go see it. You could go see it out there at the Gatton farm. You could go see that very iron pot that he had as a souvenir of his great Arab adventure. But if you'd go there today, you would not see that iron pot. At least you wouldn't see it in the form that it used to be. Because there came a time later on, a decade or so later, when Si had just about enough of the mosquitoes out to Wildcat Hollow. Oh, they're ferocious. Nothing like mosquitoes, you know. Mosquitoes out there are just terrible. And finally he decided he'd had enough of them. And he decided that he'd get even with them once and for all. So he took that iron pot, the very iron pot he'd brought back from his great adventure. He took it out there and he turned it over upside down. And he got underneath it, you see. He got underneath this iron pot and waited underneath that iron pot. He waited under there with a little hammer he had. A little hammer. He waited until he heard a mosquito come flying along. Not an ordinary mosquito. This is one of these king-size Wildcat Hollow mosquitoes flying along. It landed outside of there on the surface of the pot. And then Cy waited as that mosquito began to drill its stinger through that iron pot, you see, trying to get at him. Well, Cy let that mosquito drill that stinger through about 1.5 inches, and then he took his little hammer and he whacked it over sideways, you see, so that the mosquito couldn't get loose. Well, now, pretty long soon, here comes his brother. He's doing the same thing, drilling that one through, and the whole mosquito family pretty soon was all over that pot, drilling their stingers in, trying to get to Cy. You see, he's in there whacking them stingers over sideways just as fast as they were coming in. And then finally, after the whole surface of that iron pot had been covered with mosquitoes, all of them with their stingers stuck and all of them flapping their wings as hard as they could, why, what do you think? Why, you know already, that iron pot begun to rise. That's right, it rose in the air. Higher and higher it went. And there Cy stood, watching the only souvenir he had of his great Arab adventure, disappearing over the trees toward Mansfield. But he put an ad in the Mansfield paper. He said if anybody found such a pot, they should get in touch, and sure enough, here a week later, a farmer did. A farmer let him know that he had such a pot, just meeting the description, at least almost meeting it, caught up in an old hickory tree that he had out on his farm. So Cy took the wagon up, and he got that iron pot down, and he brought it back home. Yes, it was the same iron pot, but he couldn't use it, of course, for an iron pot anymore, being as it was all full of holes, you see, from the mosquitoes. But what he did was, instead, he set it up onto a tripod. And he sluiced a stream down into it. You see, down into the top of it, yes. And he invented the first shower bath that was ever seen in Richland County. Well, it was the autumn of the year, and Cy, an old man by now, he was looking down into the Clear Fork River, watching that great river flow by there as it does, and as it has these thousands of years in the southern end of Richland County, the Clear Fork of the Mohican, flowing by, an old man in the autumn of his years, and standing there in the autumn of the year, looking down into the water, looking down off of a great swinging bridge that they had there over the Clear Fork River. He looked down into the river, and there he saw a catfish looking up back at him, a catfish with a curious glint of intelligence in its eye. And Cy knew right then that he and that catfish were going to become friends, that their destinies were intertwined. Well, now, Cy had a sandwich along with him. Just by chance that day, he had a sandwich stuck in his pocket. He took that sandwich out of his pocket, and he pulled off a piece of bread off of that sandwich, and he rolled it into a ball. And then he flung it out there, out to that catfish. And the catfish came swimming right up and got it. And then Cy went down off that swinging bridge. He went over to the side of the river, right to the river's edge, pulled off another piece of bread, rolled it up into a ball, and flung it up about, 5-6 feet out into the water. The catfish, no shyness there, came right up, grabbed that bread ball, and went swimming back out into the water. Another piece of bread, rolled it up into a bread ball, and this time he dropped it about 2 feet out there in the water. The catfish came up pretty shallow there, working his way through the mud, those little fins having to squirm. He got up, he grabbed that bread ball, and back he went. Well, then Cy thought the moment had come. He took a particularly large bread ball, and he spit on it to make it sweet. That's right. He laid it down right on the very edge where the beach comes down to meet the water. And that catfish went clear to the other side of the stream. And he stood back there, he started spinning his fins, you see, working his way, and then finally he cut himself loose and took off through the water. He came plowing up through the mud, through the shallow mud. He grabbed that bread ball and Cy let out a shout, hallelujah! And the catfish went swimming right on back out into the water. Well, now it wasn't another half an hour later before he had him coming out 4 inches out onto the beach, and then 6, 8 inches. And by the end of the afternoon, why, he had him coming out there, and he came back every day for a week, working with that catfish, teaching him tricks. Why, sure, he had him up there out of the water half an hour at a time, teaching him to roll over, and got him kind of wobbly at first, got him to stand up on his hind fins, you know. And then he brought along a barrel hoop. He's teaching the catfish to jump up through the barrel hoop. It was amazing. But he was working on the biggest trick of all. Trying to get that catfish to jump up into his pocket, you see. Trying to jump from a standing position right up into the mouth. He had a bread ball. He's holding it right there. He's saying, come on, boy, come on. I know you can do it. The catfish was doing its best, working its way almost up. He couldn't quite get it. He couldn't quite manage to get right up into the pocket when all of a sudden Cy felt a raindrop on his neck. And he looked up, and here, why, once again, yes, the rain was coming down. The rain was pouring down. He thought, oh, my wagon, the horses. He ran over to the wagon, ran over to the horses. He clicked back into the barn, and the rain finally let up. The rain stopped, and then the horses were soaking. He had to dry them off good. He himself was drenched. He went back into the house, and by now, you see, evening was setting in. He's taking off his wet things when he noticed that why, the catfish. Yes, it had leaped into his pocket just at the last moment there. Just as he'd looked up, the catfish had gone into his pocket. Well, now it was already nightfall. He didn't want to take the catfish back to the river yet, and so, well, he just put the catfish down in the corner of the kitchen. Tried to make him feel at home just for the night. Figured he'd take him back in the morning, see, give him a bowl of bread balls so he'd feel at home, and left him there. Well, when Cy came down the next morning, the catfish was fine. Why, sure, they had looked just spry as ever, so he thought he'd keep him another day and see how he did. And after that, he was fine. They just kept him on. They kept him on for a pet. Just got to be part of the family. I mean, Mrs. Gatton come down in the morning, make the breakfast things, the bacon and the biscuit. That catfish had a curious way of hanging on to the hem of her dress. And as she walked around the kitchen, the catfish just right along with her all around the kitchen, you know. And at night, the catfish would creep along the hall and down in and find a crack open in Cy's bedroom door. He'd come up the side of the bedpost, work its way onto the pillow, and pull Cy's great walrus mustache over his shoulder like this, you see, and just cuddle up right on next to him. Yeah, catfish. And it got to where Cy, he didn't want to roll over at night for fear of squashing the catfish. You know, he had to be careful just how he slept. Well, they went everywhere together, all over the farm. But Cy had never taken him into town yet, never taken him into Belleville proper. And he knew there'd be some skepticism about whether the catfish actually was a pet and could actually do these things. And finally, well, he decided the day had come. And so he hitched up the wagon, and the catfish was riding in his pocket as he always rode, right in there, snug and secure. And Cy yelled out for Earl. He said, Earl, Earl, you want to ride in with me here, go in Belleville, show these skeptics about this catfish I've been telling? He said, sure, Pa. So Earl got up onto the wagon with him. Now, Earl was of an age when he was interested in, well, I guess you'd call it physics, such as that. You know, he was working on perpetual motion, and he was interested in how axles worked and wheels and what. And as they rode into town, Earl kept looking down, watching the wheel go around here, just studying it, watching the rotations, watching how the spokes bore the tension, how the axle functioned. He was just so interested. Mechanical things had obsessed his curiosity. He was watching all this. And Cy kept saying to him, now, son, he said, Earl, now look, you're missing the glories of Mother Nature. I mean, all around us here. Look, you got green trees and blue skies, majestic processions of the clouds here on a summer's day, and riding along and here. And Earl wouldn't look. Why, he kept looking on down the whole time. And looking down the whole time like that, why, when they got into town, Earl finally looked up, and his eyes was totally crossed. He couldn't straighten them out. Not no how, not no way. And Cy saw this. He was alarmed. He said, boy, he shook him by the shoulders. He turned him upside down by the ankles and yanked him like this, and nothing would do. The boy's eyes were ruined, totally crossed, you see. And Cy, he took no pleasure in that day. He went around, showed the catfish off, put him through its paces, jumped through the barrel hoop, whatnot, but it gave him no pleasure. And here he was thinking the whole time, what's he going to tell the boy's mother? How the boy's eyes were ruined and he was responsible. Well, now here he was, and there wasn't nothing to do about it. The day was over. Time to go back to the farm. And so with a heavy heart, he helped poor Earl, helped him get up onto the buckboard seat there. He had him placed, and he's just getting ready with a sigh to get the horses started when suddenly it come over him what he needed to do. Why, sure, all of a sudden it was obvious. Why, he said, Earl, I said, you want to look at that wheel? Now, by golly, you're going to look at it. And he took the boy's neck and he held him down. He said, now, don't you take those crossed eyes of yours off of that wheel. Now, don't you look away. You just stare at that wheel. And what he did was he backed the wagon up, you see, all the way back home. And sure enough, when he got home, the boy's eyes were straight as an arrow. Well, a whole year had gone by since he'd first spotted that catfish. And he was standing out there once again on that swinging bridge, looking down into the water and thinking back on what a adventuresome and fun-filled life he'd had there living on that farm in the blessed part of the world, southern Richland County, looking down there from this swinging bridge, thinking back on all the things that had happened, thinking back on one particular day, standing there with that catfish in his pocket, thinking back on that day, yes, but even further. thinking back to his childhood, back to a time when he had just been about 9 years old, he must have thought, must have been, and they had had a Sunday school picnic right at this very spot. A Sunday school picnic. Oh, all the women of the congregation brought their best dishes. Why, they spread it out on great tables beside the river. There was fried chicken and green bean casserole and spaghetti and fried chicken and scalloped corn and scalloped potatoes and fried chicken and sliced tomatoes and corn on the cob and fried chicken and lemonade and hot tea and a coffee and lemonade and fried chicken. And because, you see, the preacher, he loved fried chicken. That's right. Oh, the preacher, it was his favorite. And all the women of the congregation, they'd try to make the best fried chicken they could and give it to him, you know, and he'd have to pronounce which was the best. But finally, you see, after he'd eaten all he could hold, and they'd all had eaten all they could hold, while it was later on, the kids were swimming down in the water. And the preacher went up onto the swinging bridge. And he was looking down into the water, you see, watching the lambs of his flock down there splashing and cavorting in the water. When all of a sudden, it must have been one of the hairs of his mustache, must have somehow kind of corkscrewed and curled up one which way or another right up into his nose, because suddenly he felt that he had an overpowering and irresistible desire to sneeze, which he did. He sneezed, and the sound of his sneeze was followed by the sound of something going flop into the river. Well, what was it? Well, he looked, and here, why, he had sneezed so hard, the preacher had, that his false teeth had flown out of his mouth and went right down into the water. Now, you see, all the kids wanted to be the hero of the day, wanted to be the one to save the preacher's false teeth. And so they were all rooting around down there in the mud trying to find him, you know, but Cy, he didn't waste any time with that. Even though he's 9 years old, he was smarter than that. What he did was he went out along the river here, and he found there on those tables, he found a leftover leg of chicken, a great big greasy leg of chicken. And he took some twine and he tied it onto that leg of chicken. He went up there right alongside the preacher and he lowered that right down into the water. And you know, when that chicken leg came floating along the bottom of that river, and those false teeth, why, they made a grab at it, you see. And that's how he saved the preacher's false teeth. So he was standing there, like I told you, thinking about this, you see, thinking back on that happy day, when all of a sudden it must have been that one of the hairs of his mustache must have somehow started to corkscrew around and curlicue up into his nose some which way or other, because suddenly he, CY GATTON, felt that he had an overpowering and irresistible desire to sneeze. And he sneezed. He let out a great sneeze, and the sound of his sneeze was followed by the sound of something going flop into the river. Well, what was it? Quick, he checked his false teeth. No, they were still there. Well, what could it be? And then he realized that his pocket was empty. Why, it was the catfish. The catfish had heard that sneeze. It had startled him, and he had jumped out of the pocket, not knowing they were on those swinging bridge, and he had landed in that water, plop, right there, and Cy was, oh, he ran down off the swinging bridge as fast as an old man can run, and he got out there to the edge of the river. He didn't care. He had his clothes on. He didn't care. He waded right into the river. He went as fast as he could, struggling with the current to get out to the middle, but it was too late, because by the time he made it to the middle of that river, why, the catfish had already drowned. Oh, he mourned that catfish. And if it had not been for the consolation he had drew from his dog that summer, he didn't know how he'd have made it that whole following year. That dog story, the dog story, the best known of all Cy's stories, the last of our stories here tonight. The story of Cy and his dog. Oh, this dog. This dog that brought him such glory and satisfaction at the end of his years. This dog, the fastest dog that any man ever had. This dog was fast. I mean to tell you, this dog was fast. This dog, get running full speed, why, it would take 3 people to see him. That's right. One had to stand there and say, here he comes. One say, here he is. One say, there he went. But the thing was that nobody would believe him. They'd say, oh, you go on now. You say these stories, people from Columbus and Cleveland, they'll believe you, but we're your neighbors. You know, we don't hold with these tall tales of yours. And oh, it's true. He said, no, I have the fastest dog any man ever had. And so finally, well, he said, do you think you have a faster dog? I said, you think you have a dog that's faster than my dog? You just see. We're going to have ourselves a race. You bring your dog down to my farm this coming Saturday afternoon, we're going to have ourselves a race. We're just going to see who has the fastest hunting dog. Well, that Saturday afternoon came, and all those dogs were lined up for the race. Cy's dog's in there with the rest of them. You could tell already who's going to win that race. Si's the only dog in there was getting warmed up. He's in there doing push-ups. I don't know if you ever saw a dog do push-ups. What they did was they got a little red fox, swift and sly. A little red fox. They let that little red fox go. They let him run out in front of those dogs. They let that little red fox run up in front of those dogs about 100 yards up there in front of them. And then on a signal, they cut those dogs loose, and those dogs took off after that fox. And right from the start, CY Gatton's dogs out in front of the rest of them, just leaving the rest of them miles behind. Running along, lickety split, like I told you, so fast for people to see him. When I say, here he comes. When I say, there he is. When I say, there, when I say, pshoom. I mean, I can hardly talk fast enough to come inside. How fast he's going. Just, pshoom. I mean, this dog is fast. Now, the fox is fast, too, but he's not that fast. The fox, he looks over his shoulder once in a while. He sees this one dog is gaining on him. It's CY Gatton's dog catching up with him. And the fox begins to realize that Swift isn't going to cut it. He's going to have to start being sly, you see. But how is he going to be sly? I mean, here he is. He's a fox. He's running across a bare, empty, open field. There's no holes in the ground. There's no hollow trees. There's no logs. How is he going to be sly? Well, it just so happened that fate or destiny or providence or whatever you want to call it, put in the path of that fox, that historic day, an opportunity in the form of a mowing scythe. Yes, once again, that long-handled farm tool with a razor-sharp blade 3 feet long. CY had been mowing that same morning and had left that mowing scythe, forgetting all about the race, left it laying there in the grass with its razor-sharp blade sticking 3 feet up straight toward the heavens. Now along comes this fox. He says, here's my chance. The fox runs right along the handle, narrowly misses that razor-sharp blade, runs to the top of the hill, and he stops. Now picture with me, if you can, a red fox against the green trees, against the blue skies of Richland County. And now here, seconds later, comes this dog, barreling down lightning fast. You see, imagine the force behind that dog as he comes up on this mowing scythe. You see him not knowing it's there, not knowing there's no razor-sharp blade laying there in the grass. He looks up and he sees that fox in the distance. Now, you know, a dog does not see the world the way we see. A dog sees the world in a kind of a dim and doggy way, you know. You might almost say a dog sees with his nose, you know, following the scent of that fox. Why, sure, he looks up with what sight he does have. It's that fox. He stopped. There he was. The fox stopped at the top of the hill, looking back down into the valley, looking down at this mowing scythe with a smug smile on his face. And the dog's thinking, yes, I'm going to have him. Oh, up that hill, 2, 3 seconds at the most. I'll have that fox. I'll have him between my jaws. All the time coming closer and closer onto this blade, unbeknownst to him, but known to us, barreling down lightning fast. I hope there's nobody here that's squeamish. Barreling down on it, coming down on full speed ahead like this. Well, now to make a long story interminable, it caught him right between the eyes. Oh, yes. And it sliced him in half. Right on down through the middle from the tip of his nose, right on down out through the tip of his tail. Just like that. Oh! And both halves of that dog were still running. Only they were running around crazy like in circles like this every which way. You see, inside he could see he's going to lose the race. So he ran up there as fast as he could. He grabbed one half of that dog under this arm. He grabbed the other half of that dog under this arm. He knelt down there on the spot, slapped the two halves of that dog together, whipped out a needle he had and some thread, and he started sewing him up underneath the chin, sewing as fast as a man can sew, and all of a sudden he heard barking behind him. He looked around, and here come the rest of the dogs. Here come only 100 yards behind him. We'll say he's sewing underneath the belly, sewing up around the tail. The dog's only 50 yards behind, sewing down the back, sewing down toward the collar. The dog's 25 yards behind. He only had about 10 more stitches to go. 10, 9, 8, 7. The dogs are just about on him. 5, 4, 3, 2. He tied the final knot, and then he looked back to examine his work. And why, what do you think? Why he'd been paying so much attention to them dogs coming from behind it. He hadn't been watching what he was doing, and do you know, he had sewn that dog back together with 2 of its legs going down and 2 of them going up. But do you know that dog was even faster after that? Why, sure, now he'd get run on these 2 legs. When he got tired, he'd just flip over and run on these 2. Now, there were a lot of stories told about that dog later on that were not true. No, you never would have heard CY claim that dog could bark out of both ends. That was just made up.
These stories are like antiques. They're something we cherish, something we take out for special occasions, but they're not for every day. They're cultural artifacts, and they can be appreciated as such. At the heart of every tall tale, there is an unanswerable question.
Why are there limitations on anything? What determines how fast a plant can grow? Why can't a catfish be trained to live outside the water? And why can a dog run only so fast? And there are larger questions too. What is birth? What is death? Why do there have to be beginnings and endings? Well, these are questions that are only asked by children and philosophers and maybe an exceptional scientist. CY Gatton's stories don't attempt to answer these questions. CY wasn't interested in speculation. What fascinated him, I think, and apparently his audiences, was the challenge of posing these questions in the guise of stories. Stories as vividly conceived and intensely told as he could make them. And perhaps not surprisingly, people today seem to have a keen appetite for stories like these. And my audiences, modern-day Americans, listen to these tall tales with expressions of awe and rapture moving across their faces like the shadows of clouds moving across a cornfield on a summer day.